Welcome to the session, everyone. I'm Rachel Blackburn. I'm on the corporate operations team at Oracle, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is part of a weekly Oracle at Oracle webinar series where we have the opportunity to hear from the executive team that reimagined Oracle. In this series of webinar, we'll share insights from our own journey to the cloud and demonstrate how we're using Oracle Cloud to power our business and enable exceptional customer and employee experiences, and share our learnings so others can do the same. Let's dive into today's topic. So over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to hear Oracle's strategy for delivering a future-ready supply chain with Oracle Cloud. Now I'll pass it over to your webinar hosts for today, Giovanni and Shaker, to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do at Oracle.
Welcome to this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, or maybe even good evening, depending on who you are. Today, we will talk about how we made our supply chain more adaptive and scalable with Oracle Cloud. But before I go into that, I'll summarize the supply chain topic within Oracle for you so you have a bit better understanding of what supply chain means in the Oracle context. I'll, after that, tell you about how we approached our transformation, what we implemented, and how. We'll be talking about the benefits and how it's helping us in our day-to-day execution. And I'll talk about some challenges and lessons that came up in our transformation. And we'll finish, as Rachel said, with questions and answers at the end. My name is Giovanni Schwerdijk. I'm part of a central team in supply chain operations. We lead strategy and business transformation for our supply chain. And over the past 2+ years, me and my team have spent most of our time preparing for this transformation, as well as implementing the actual application suite, and right now fine-tuning it through the quarterly update process. And with me today is Shaker Palaniswamy. Shaker is a leader within our OAL organization, and you should think about that as our implementation partner that I'm sure many of you work with as well in different forms and shapes. Shaker's organization has helped us make the right configuration decisions, prepare for the implementation, obviously, validate that our work processes and our workflows do what they're supposed to do, and through the quarterly updates, help us test and validate the changes as well. And they've provided operational support in many cases too. Shaker, do you want to add anything to that?
No, you covered it excellently. Thank you, Gio.
Okay. I need to show you this slide. Many of you might have seen this in different forms, but I'll give you a few seconds to scan through this. So let's talk about hardware, supply chain, and Oracle. You might know Oracle better from our software, whether that's application software or database. But since 2010, after the acquisition of Sun Microsystems, Oracle has had a pretty significant supply chain as well. Our bread and butter is based on networked servers, either x86-based technology or Spark. And we support products these days under the names of the Exadata platform. You might have heard of that, or the Spark T8 and the Spark M12 products. We also have a significant storage product line, and that includes tape storage, hard drive storage, as well as flash-based technology. And we have a set of networking equipment solutions as well. On top of that, in the last 4 to 5 years or so, we've included in our supply chain, in our support offering, a retail and hospitality product line. And that's the reason why you see this triple on the right side of this slide. Why I call that out specifically is that most of our data center focused technology, the traditional Sun Microsystems architecture, that is almost uniquely configured to order. So we drive a high degree of postponement there with lots of choice. The Micros product line is built to forecast and ship from inventory. And I mention this because we're operating both models at scale, and as a result have to deal with the challenge that each of these present us. I think it's obvious that historically this technology was mostly deployed at a customer site, either managed, owned by themselves or by a partner. But that has changed quite significantly over the last number of years. These days, most of you will be consuming technology, whether it's application software or database or even infrastructure through the cloud. And Oracle has its own cloud infrastructure, our data center network that, and you might not know this, is powered by Oracle's own hardware. And as a result of that, our supply chain and the customer base of our supply chain has quite radically shifted from traditionally more on-premise, unique, smaller scale deployments to cloud supporting deployments, clearly with very different requirements and different characteristics. Scale is more important, global coverage is more important, and in different ways. Even lead times or replenishment responses and cost effectiveness play a different role in that industry. And in the middle, I don't intend to spend a lot of time on that, but we have a hybrid offering as well, which is essentially cloud architecture, cloud technology that customers can deploy behind their own firewall. It's really, in terms of requirements and characteristics, a combination of both on-premise and cloud. So I'll come on to this later, but to give you an idea of when we talk about hardware, what we mean. So some numbers to give you a sense of scope and size, and I'll start at the left bottom side. We still do our own final assembly and testing. We do that in the US. We have a US-based facility where we do our higher-end products, mostly final assembly based on sub-assemblies that we get from contract manufacturers and final test activities. But we, for the volume of our product, depend mostly on our contract manufacturers across the world. We have 4 main contract manufacturer sites that we work with that are usual names. In the planning domain, we plan a little bit over 200 configured to order models. So I mentioned this earlier, it's almost all configured to order and not fixed configurations. And we don't have just one plan, but we plan individually for all the dropship organizations that we fulfill from across the world. Logistics-wise, we do around about 70,000 deliveries across more than 130 countries, all the developed countries and most of the developing, as you can imagine. And we source material from a multitude of source points, all the dropship source points, as well as our internal manufacturing side, and we have a remanufacturing side as well. And we do around 40,000 orders a year. So many orders that we do are multi-line. You might recognize that. In some cases, we are required or requested to do consolidated deliveries. So not just one single line at a time, but all together. So we deal with that complexity as well. And those numbers are for commercial and cloud combined. And the part number count in the middle at the top, we have about 5,000 orders, orderable items today on our price list. The majority of that are spares. So the core of our technology is a lot smaller than that. And we leverage, obviously, the configure to order concept, keeping our part number count down. But we do, in order to support that at an orderable level, have about 12,000 active items all the way throughout the bill of material. In the sourcing area, we work with 100 roughly direct suppliers, and we do collaboration with them on forecast with 60 of those. In the middle part, I'll skip some of this, but what might surprise you is that our lead times are fairly short for an almost completely configured to order model. About 2/3 of our products we have ready for shipment after 5 days of booking, so book to ship, roughly 5-day cycle time. And we do target a mid-90s on-time ship and deliver performance level. So very important for us to be predictable, both in on-timely shipment and on-time deliveries. And with that, let me tell you more about why we felt we needed to change and why it was interesting for us to consider supply chain cloud. I mentioned earlier on the fairly dramatic shift from on-premise to supporting our own cloud data centers, and that drove challenges in our supply chain architecture to support that in the most optimal way. We couldn't easily, as an example, support multiple source points across the world and dynamically source depending on availability and needs. And that had to do with our past, the architecture that we had customized to quite a significant extent. It was all EBS and VCP based, but it made it difficult for us to be agile and to respond to these new developing requirements. Another example in the planning domain is we weren't even able to use the latest value chain planning suite of solutions in the years prior to our transition. And again, related to the customizations we had done and made in our previous VCP footprint. And it was too painful for us to continually retrofit the new releases and stay up to date on the latest release as a result. So we needed to do something different, not just to stay responsive and agile, but also to make our operating model more efficient. And we had an effective infrastructure in place. It's not that it wasn't doing the things it needed to do, but it was more manual and more involved than we wanted it to be. We had created essentially our own version of what's now called a dropship capability, and where we were able to transfer demand from our customers to our suppliers and had sales orders on one hand and purchase orders on the other to reflect the demand. But we weren't able to automatically keep the two synchronized. Well, that meant that in case of any changes, whether it's a customer changing their installation plans for many reasons, or suppliers running into test challenges or supply shortages, we had to update either the sales order or the corresponding purchase order manually every time. And that's just one example of where our processes weren't as efficient as we need them to be for cloud, and there was a strong need to reconsider the way we had solved for that. On the innovation side, clearly there's a lot happening in supply chain these days, whether it's new machine learning solutions that are being integrated, or AI in general, whether it's IoT, connecting factories through IoT, and it became more and more clear that the cloud applications were the right place for these new concepts to be integrated and to be utilized as best as possible. And lastly, we wanted to lead by example and really show the industry that you can effectively run a fairly sizable supply chain on Oracle's cloud applications, and show other potential customers examples of how to do that. So how did we approach this? Key for us at the beginning, given the amount of change that we were looking at, was to make sure that there was no question that this was the right thing and the required thing to do for Oracle as an organization. So we made sure that with our leadership at the time, Safra Katz, and our supply chain leader, Cindy Rees, that we made an explicit statement that for all impacted parties, this was a priority going forward, not just within supply chain, but also within the surrounding functions, whether that's finance or our quote-to-order organization. And it was really important because there were some significant areas of change that we were looking at, and we needed people to be open-minded and willing to accept alternatives, or at least consider them. We also said that we did not want to recreate the past. There might have been good reasons why our supply chain had been organized like it was over the years, but we clearly did not want to be stuck in past decisions. We wanted to look ahead and make sure that we organized for our future, and that we let go of some of the values, maybe even, or the expectations that had formed over the years. How we did that, and this is on the bottom left, we started by defining what is really key for our supply chain going forward, the key design priorities and principles to help shape our design process, and to help also decide what was essential versus nice to have. We defined around about 10 key priorities that we believed were really essential. Things like, we want to be largely outsourced. We want to drive a configure-to-order model at scale to allow for enough variability. We want to build a model that's based on fixed lead times as opposed to do available to promise, in order to provide speed and efficiency. And that really guided us in the design process, as well as in the configuration choices that we had to make along the way. And what it also resulted in, and that's in the middle here, we had initially planned to implement all the relevant supply chain applications in one go on a global go live. But because we needed certain key features that weren't immediately available in the product set at the time that we looked at this, which was early in 2017, it became clear that a better way for us to keep momentum and to keep driving progress was to break things apart into two sections. And I'll show you later how we did that. But we essentially went with a two-step global go-live schedule as a result. Lastly, in the change management area, very important to us, we defined early an infrastructure based on stakeholders in the user organization that had explicit accountability for change management, preparing their organization for the change to come, identifying the priority features that really needed to be ensured and validated, and working with the project team and with the configuration groups to make sure that both leading up to the transition as well as going through the transition and after the implementation to follow through, that both the IT specialists and the business users were on the same page. So with that, let me show you what we ended implementing. And you might recognize this core components here in the middle: plan, source, make, deliver. In planning, we effectively implemented all the planning applications within Supply Chain Management Cloud: demand management, supply planning, S&OP, and the supply chain collaboration features. And we didn't do this immediately, but I'll come on to that in a minute, for all four, but we're live on all four today. In sourcing, we're using supplier qualification management, the RFQ flows. We use both direct and indirect procurement. We use all the costing and sourcing functionality that's underlying that. And we do use global order promising as well, which is tied to the order management process, but drives the tactical sourcing and availability process, as some of you might know. In the make category, we're using discrete manufacturing. Probably not a surprise to you, but that's most applicable to our process. We use all the inventory management solutions in Supply Chain Cloud. And I call out OTBI, or transactional BI, here specifically, not that it's only used in the manufacturing domain, but we have a fairly strong use case, particularly for manufacturing, where it's really adding a lot of value. But we use the same concepts for the other modules as well, in case you were wondering. In the delivery domain, we implemented transportation management for the first time, Oracle Transportation Management. Although we're largely outsourced, we have a third-party logistics provider that does the global distribution on our behalf. We use this for sourcing, routing the delivery orders, particularly between multiple partners. And we will very soon use this for freight calculations as well in our quoting and order entry process. And we use global trade management for our international moves. So that's the core of our execution framework. At the bottom in the enabling layer, you'll see the product management applications that we use to prepare our supply chain, make sure that we can take demand and plan for demand for the right products, and they're set up the way they need to be set up. The references to the quality features as well that we leverage as best as possible, things like inspections and issues and actions. And the field service box is in dotted line because we have not moved our field service processes to cloud just yet. That will follow in the coming year. At the top, I put a number of orchestration activities. It is very critical, essential in this framework to make sure that these application areas talk to each other effectively, as you can imagine. So both financial orchestration, supply orchestration functionalities are really at the heart of making this framework work. And I listed order management here as well. And part of the reason is that it connects to most of the functions listed on this slide. And for us in supply chain, it is really something that, that I guess we take as input. We don't own order management ourselves, although we're dependent on it heavily, as you can imagine, as well as a key feedback provider. But today, although we use cloud order management to reflect our demand for planning and execution, we don't do initial order entry in cloud order management just yet. And that's the reason also why on the top right-hand side, you see pricing initial order entry in dotted lines. We are about halfway, maybe a little further than that, getting our code to order organization to move to cloud order management in the middle of next year. So a couple of things to come there. There are some other examples of functionality that we don't run on SCM Cloud today. And the next slide is a little bit better explanation of that. And I'm going to ask Shaker to explain to the audience how this fits together.
Hello, everybody. I hope you guys can hear me loud and clear. This is a architectural landscape overview of our deployment. What Gio presented was the functional modules that are being used in supply chain. Before we got into supply chain, we had already implemented ERP cloud solutions using HCM, accounts receivable, and as such. And then came our supply chain cloud deployment, including the logistics capability. Now, as part of supply chain cloud, we went already a year ago, before supply chain execution went live with planning. And subsequent to that, we went live with the full bang SCM execution. As part of that, the strategy was to deploy our product development and product hub, which is our product lifecycle management. A month earlier than the execution, and given that product is essential across the framework of the supply chain. And we had a strategic cutover on that and managing our on-prem systems. As and when we went live with supply chain cloud with all the global trade and Oracle transport management, we also realized while implementing that there were certain solutions or functions that business users actively was not on the roadmap, such as the product compliance and governance on product development. We migrated from Agile 9 to product development. So I believe that product compliance and governance is still not there on the roadmap. So we went and built, using the Oracle development tools, Page Composer and Apps Composer, and a few system tables in PAS to do a light version of product compliance and governance for ROHS compliance. We also built a supply chain, fabulous supply chain for our chip, given that Oracle shop floor was not on the roadmap for us. And a few little things just to demonstrate that you can also build your own suite of little tools on PaaS solution to aid with your supply chain. Now, as we did this, given that spares and field service was still not on the roadmap from a product perspective, we had to keep those core functionalities on-prem, and that's why you see the big yellow box down below where we have all of our field service spares-related things. Now, for such, the PIM BOM inventory needs to be in sync, given that the cloud became the system of record for all product lifecycle management. We built a seamless integration from supply chain cloud to our on-prem master data so that they are always in sync. And everything goes through the cloud ICS framework, any interconnectivity between all the logistics cloud, Fusion Cloud, PaaS Cloud, and on-prem, including our 3PL partners. So with that, I think from a function perspective, pretty much Gio has covered everything. So I will hold off and answer any such questions in the Q&A. So back to you, Gio.
Thanks, Shaker. So let's go back to our implementation then. I decided to put this slide in the pack to illustrate that the transformation like this, the complexity of it and the size, it's really not an event, but a journey. And I mentioned earlier on, and Shaker referred to it as well, that we went live in 2 steps. So you see that on the second timeline in 2018. But first, the replan that we did in the middle of 2017 was really the point that we did decide to break it up into and go with planning first, and then with the rest of execution later. And so we had about 6 months to get ready for the implementation of cloud planning, demand management, supply planning, SNOP, and then 9 months more to get all the execution functionality ready. So that's how we prepared, how we tested, how we migrated, but it didn't stop there. And that's an important point for me that I need to share with you. After that, we have already taken 6 updates, quarter by quarter, sometimes 2 months apart, sometimes 3 months apart. There was a switch in the schedule at some point. But each of them have allowed us to uptake new functionality, new features that our product development organization has introduced into the product set, as well as reconsider past configuration decisions and fine-tune and update our supply chain makeup to the needs of today, whether that's suppliers moving, whether that's product lines being introduced with new requirements, or whether that's new business processes that weren't relevant last year but are important today. So it has absolutely helped us to almost, as a routine, as a process, ask ourselves whether our supply chain is working the way we need it to, and where it's not, consider the right changes and implement those almost in a methodical, repetitive manner. And it really has changed our mindset in terms of dealing with change, both on the requirement side and the solution side. So you might wonder, is it working? What is it doing for us? And this is just a short summary of some benefits we see. It's not exhaustive. With regards to complexity, you might think that with all these applications talking to each other, that's not necessarily much simpler than what you must have had before. And that's true to an extent, although it's all different from what it used to be on the same data model, on the single platform. And it has, as a result of that, removed all the complexities of making the different functional areas talk to each other with the right definition of data, with the right timing, the synchronization between the different applications areas, and the potential disconnects as a result. This was very significant for us prior to transferring to cloud. And we spent a lot of time understanding whether the batch loads between different areas had successfully completed, whether there were problems or not, and if so, why, and correcting it. Wasn't necessarily a weekly occurrence, but very frequently we had to reconsider the data interaction between the different areas. And that's now effectively gone. It's not that it's automatic. We had to spend a lot of time up front in designing it right, but it runs, and it's all based on the same data definition, and the architecture allows you to interact or share data almost without thinking about it. So a big change there. In terms of velocity and responsiveness, we were able, as a result, partially, or to a large extent actually, to reduce our planning cycles from what used to be 3 to 4 weeks to now 1 week. We're able to start on Monday with a demand statement, run it through scenario planning, make decisions on risk mitigation, run it through our MRP on Thursday, and then publish the output of that to our supply base on Friday morning. And we often get responses to that later that same day already, and if not, over the weekend on Monday morning to start a new cycle again. So we're a lot more responsive and faster dealing with change in demand assessments. In case we don't want to run a full MRP, or because it's not needed, if it's isolated, we can make incremental changes within 24 hours, make a change today, communicate that, and get a response from our suppliers tomorrow. So that part of our process is a lot more nimble and fast. I talked about dropship earlier on, the fact that in cloud now, our dropship capability allows sales orders and purchase orders to be synchronized automatically. We don't have to manually keep the two in line anymore. Has taken out a lot of manual touch, a lot of confusion as well, and has made our operating model a lot more efficient and clean. On the innovation side, and this refers to the previous slide, we already took 6 incremental updates since go live, and we're really now in this new normal of reviewing our supply chain makeup every quarter and considering new features and new functionality almost as a matter of process. We really feel that we're at the forefront of where the industry is going right now, where prior to the transformation, we were struggling to keep up. Quite a big difference. So with that, some reflection as well. Because clearly this wasn't easy, and we had a few months after initial go live to really adjust and get all the changes under control the way we needed to. What has been paramount throughout this, and what my advice to you would be, is if you're considering a move like this, be ready for change, embrace agility, be ready to reconsider choices that you've made, thinking that it was the right choice at the time prior to implementing new functionality. We found examples where changes in one domain resulted in challenges in another that we had not anticipated to the right extent. And we really needed about between 2 and 4 months to let this new system of applications work together the way it was intended to. And we made a fair amount of changes in configuring that optimally. So be ready for that, plan for addressing surprises, and make sure that you have all the right players in a framework that you can have those conversations in terms of how to best respond. In terms of dependencies, the larger challenge for us was not so much to get all the individual domains doing what they're designed to do. That was fairly predictable and manageable, I would say. The bigger difficulty was for us to get all the applications work together smoothly and have the interaction work without hiccups and interruptions. We underestimated that, if I'm honest. I personally should have prioritized this a lot higher in terms of the validation that we did. We did all the core design and the workflow design from start to finish, but we didn't pay enough attention to change management in particular. If something changes with a purchase order in the procurement module, what does it do to order management, as an example, at the sales order level? And that should have received a little bit more attention upfront. We've addressed that now, but it would have been better if more of that had been done upfront. So that's another important lesson for us. Pay attention to the interconnections and the dependencies, in particular dealing with change. On the process side, clearly going with cloud in general almost forces or compels you to consider industry standard solutions. And it really requires to have a mindset that what's industry standard is likely better than doing everything unique. And the mindset of, but we're different, is one that you would need to challenge within your user organizations. Clearly, there are a few things that make you stand out compared to your industry partners or competitors, but there are lots of business areas where it doesn't matter as much. And going with industry standard solutions is often a better way to make things scalable, robust, and it allows you to stay on this innovation train and be able to move with where the industry goes and uptake or internalize changes a lot more easily. In terms of user engagement, one learning for us was, although we started very early, and I think with the right sense of intensity, it was harder for us, particularly when we did the replan and had to decide that the execution side needed to wait another 9 months. It was hard to maintain the engagement and the interest with the user base. And we had to decide at one point in time to put a lot of the practical user work on hold for a time period and re-engage them later when things were more material and more tangible again, for them to be, I guess, get the value out of the engagement and be ready for the implementation itself. So suggestion, if you haven't already thought about that, think about the timing particularly as well, if you want to make sure that you get the most value out of it. Lastly, on this slide, the environment sizing itself. You might think that it's automatic, that if you go with cloud, that everything works magically the way it needs to, but you do need to pay some attention to the unique volumes, the business volumes that are relevant to your organization. Not every organization is the same, and there are some choices to be made in terms of how to dimensionalize and size the cloud services. Everything's possible, but not everything is automatic. So make sure that you do spend time on what you think the load will be on the systems, and that you decide on the sizing appropriately. So that's what I had in terms of prepared material. Rachel, we've asked for questions to be posted on the chat. Were you able to keep up with it, and have you filtered out a few that you want to post to Shaker and myself?
Yeah, and at this time, we'll go into the Q&A. There have been quite a few questions, so we're going to get to everything that we can over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. So first question that I want to direct to you, Giovanni, but both of you will probably have some insight into this. How do you manage and prepare for the quarterly updates? Is that taxing, and does it add risk?
Yeah, important question. I was personally nervous about that, knowing that it was a very different model for us, for the user organization to live with. And the first two updates were challenging, if I'm honest with you. We had to figure out how to best prepare, not just for the new changes that the new release was introducing, but also for the regression risk. And there are almost always consequences that you don't necessarily immediately anticipate. And we hadn't had that recipe down completely initially. So that took some figuring out, particularly with help from Shaker's organization. But after the second update, that whole process has become surprisingly smooth. And we've really learned a lot in terms of how to divide and conquer in a way. Shaker's organization typically spends most of the time understanding whether the configuration decisions are working the way they were anticipated, and whether any of the connectivity still works, all the regression elements. They do almost all of that, and our users are not engaged in that. And where my team and a select group of end users are getting engaged in understanding and evaluating new features and focusing on that. And together with our OAL partners, we make sure that we're effectively prepared. And we take between 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the scope of the update, to get ready for it. A lot of it is really just validation that there are no surprises. And we do a little bit of training in some cases as well, and depending on the scope of the changes, but often the changes are fairly self-explanatory, so that has not been a big task for us. But overall, I'm surprisingly happy with how easy and how smooth that is running now. There's another update coming in June. You might have seen that on one of the previous slides, and we're in the middle of validating that the functionality is working the way it needs to. And I hardly spend any time being concerned about risks or problems in that area. So surprisingly well, I would say. Shaker, anything to add from your side?
No, you covered it very well. Thank you.
Great. And Shaker, this next question is for you. What are we using for spare parts planning and management?
Right now, spare parts, as I said in my architectural picture, is on-prem. So because field service and spares, we don't have a product yet at the roadmap. So given that, in our deployment, we had spares planning as a module that was running on-prem that continues to support our on-prem spares management. So I believe in the next 1 year, 2 year, we should be moving to cloud as and when the product is available.
Great. And Giovanni, can you share more detail on how transactional BI is being used in the planning phase?
Yeah, we use the OTBI, as we refer to it internally, to essentially craft the dashboard that planners use to interpret the planning outcomes. We've looked, and this is an example that the person that asked this made me think of. We've looked at doing this in a time series manner as well, but that has been challenging. With planning particularly, you want to monitor how your planning accuracy evolves and moves over time. That is a little harder to do with the OTBI environment, knowing that it doesn't keep much history previous plans as an example. But we use that dashboard to highlight plan versus actuals in many cases, changes from week to week, things like that, things that are essential for the planners to move through that weekly cycle. In the historic analysis, we use a PaaS application that Shekhar talked about a little bit. We created our own cloud data platform in order to collect historic data and be able to do analyses over a longer time horizon. And that's what we use for planning accuracy measurements over time.
Great, thank you. And Giovanni, I believe this one you can also cover. What are we using for supplier and product quality management?
We've implemented what's available right now. We're still comparatively early in adapting all of the tools and features that are intended in this product set. We're using issues and actions today. That's where we started. So when there are non-conformances, our issues and action functionality is used to communicate with our supply base and decide on what responses are appropriate and follow through on it. And we are still working on connecting the different supply organizations automatically to that environment. That is a project that will be implemented in the next 4 to 6 weeks, actually, so that the communication is a little easier. But that's one example. We use inspections as well. We create inspection plans. We use supplier qualification management at the front end of the process to do surveys and to make sure that the suppliers that we select can meet our requirements, whether that's on the compliance side or on the financial side, even in some cases. So still a little bit early in that space, but we are using that to get surveys out to parties that have expressed interest and to drive our selection process.
Okay, great. And Shekhar, I know you've seen there have been a couple of questions concerning Oracle Warehouse Management Cloud. Could you shed some light as to where that fits into our ecosystem?
So from a business perspective, actually, Gio can answer that better when it comes to business. On warehouse management as such is not warranted from a Oracle business perspective the way we do it. We are able to do everything with our shipping and our OTM. So essentially, we also have a third-party vendor who provides that logistics capability. So we have not implemented that as a module. Ideally, we would have done Logfire. In the inception of this project, when we were going through supply chain, I was actively looking at Logfire because EBS uses WMS as a core functionality and connects everything underlying inventory, BOM, and as such. But the cloud SaaS functionalities are much more independent. So the dependency that we had in WMS in the e-business suite is gone, no more, as a functionality, and it was not warranted, so we didn't implement it. But Logfire works seamlessly on Oracle, and I'm sure there are customers who have implemented Logfire along with Oracle supply chain. Gio, you want to add anything on that? Whatever I said?
I think you covered most. As you say, our warehouse management activities are mostly outsourced, and therefore we didn't need all the features that the Logfire application provides. And we decided to go with the basic inventory module in Supply Chain Management Cloud. That's what we use for the warehousing activities that are related to our own factory, and everything else is managed by third parties.
Great. And Giovanni, can you dive a little deeper into the weekly planning cycle in terms of generating a demand statement weekly and what we use to run scenarios and for risk mitigation?
Yeah, this is an area of ongoing work for us as well. What we implemented initially was a basic weekly cycle that I tried to explain earlier on, where we start with input from our sales partners, our cloud operational organizations as well. And we aggregate everything to get to a forecast at the product level that we take as the starting point. We've experimented with multiple things. We've taken an approach in some areas where we want to apply certain risk buffers. Let's say platforms that we deem to be strategically critical. We've applied a 20 or 30% upside percentage in some cases and say we want to drive supply for a demand envelope that could potentially be 20 or 30% higher than what our sales partners tell us it will likely be. That's one of the things we tried. We use that methodology to drive the demand forecast all the way down to the supply requirements and get our suppliers, our external partners, evaluate their abilities as well. So in some cases, we had to go back and forth a number of times to, I guess, reflect the constraints that might need to be considered. Well, we do, I didn't say this explicitly, but we don't do a constrained supply plan today. We assume that what our demand forecast needs will be made available one way or the other, and we address the fallout from that. So that sometimes requires us to go back and forth and modify the demand forecast accordingly. But we're still optimizing that, the mechanical side of how that negotiation is done on a day-by-day basis in terms of getting the right approvals and getting the right feedback from our supply base effectively as well.
Okay, great. And Giovanni, are we using Oracle Adaptive Intelligence apps for manufacturing?
We've started to look at that, and areas that we've been interested in is to predict test times, as an example. We go by standard test times today based on historic data, but things change quite dynamically, and it's sometimes hard to estimate whether the amount of failures that you have in a regular test process, which is really common, will mean a 2-day or a 3-day test process. And we're hoping that if we can connect the adaptive intelligent solutions to that scheduling process, we can go by real data much better, and we can adapt to changes that happen every week almost, but certainly frequently. So that's one example. Got to think about, do you know, Shekhar, any other examples in the manufacturing space specifically where we're using this today?
You pretty much answered everything, but we are expanding on it, looking at all the various things we can do. It's a constant research that we are working with you. So yeah.
All right. Maybe to explain one thing, our manufacturing process is not that complicated, actually. The final assembly activities are reasonably straightforward. It's multi-step often, but we do use a lot of sub-assemblies that provide the starting point and then run it through often a single level bill of material. The test process is really where the complexity comes in for us, and that drives a lot of deviations and exception management. So most of our work processes and our intelligence is focused on how to manage that effectively and how to be predictable on that end.
Awesome. And we have time for just a couple more questions. So Giovanni, is demand planning available in the cloud, or is that an on-premise solution?
Demand management is actually what it's referred to technically today, and it's in the cloud. It is, if people are today using the Demantra application on premise, it's essentially the translation of that logic, that functionality onto a cloud environment. So yes is the answer.
Okay, great. And here's an interesting question for both of you. If you could go back and do one thing differently on your journey, what would it be?
Should I try to go first? One thing, although I didn't explicitly mention it, but I've spoken to lots of prospective customers or customers that are halfway through their journey that have broken their transformation up in multiple pieces. And with my experiences so far, particularly also with the quarterly updates, I would consider breaking it up into smaller chunks instead of trying to go with one big bang. The complexity of getting everything right at the same time and understanding all of the trade-offs and all of the interconnections at the same time was really quite significant for us, and made the first few months after go live not easy. And there were times where things weren't working the way they intended to be, and it was hard to find out exactly why, as an example. So my recommendation would be to consider breaking it up into smaller chunks and do it step by step. If you're willing to invest in the integration work that drives, because obviously that is the downside. You'll have to figure out a way to make these modules work within your existing footprint, and then gradually migrate to a more cloud-based footprint step by step. But I would still consider that much more seriously than we did earlier on.
Great. Shaker, anything to add on that?
No, this was great. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'll go ahead and give everyone a couple moments back in their day. Giovanni, if we could go to the next slide. Thank you so much, everyone, for submitting your questions, joining the webinar. We hope you learned something to take back to your own businesses or to your teams. After this, the webinar replay will be available within 48 hours on Oracle Video Hub. You'll receive a follow-up email shortly with instructions for how to access the replay, as well as what's up and coming in the Oracle webinar series. If you have questions that you need answered, you can always reach out to Oracle at oracle-contact_ww@oracle.com with these questions, or to schedule a conversation with an Oracle expert like Giovanni or Shaker. So thank you all so much for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.